On Production is brought to you by Wrapbook, the production industry's only on-demand payroll platform. With Wrapbook, you can pay your crew with a click and track all your costs in real time, all in one place. To find out more about how Wrapbook is transforming the way productions pay their crews, visit wrapbook.com.
Welcome to On Production, brought to you by Wrapbook. Today, I'm delighted to have Steve Caplan with me. Steve is a luminary in strategic communications and marketing, and the founder of Message. With a career spanning roles such as senior advisor at the United Nations Climate Change Conference and executive vice president at the Association of Independent Commercial Producers, Steve has been a pivotal figure in addressing complex policy issues through innovative communication strategies. Today, he's with me to share his insights on leveraging media for social change and his journey through the dynamic landscape of strategic communication. Steve, thanks for joining me on Production.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So first up, share with me what inspired you to found Message and how your background in political science and government really influenced your approach to strategic communication and policy strategy.
Yeah, thanks for that. You know, I've had a really interesting career, and I appreciate some of the items you ticked off there. And I've really spent the entirety of my career, especially my early career, sort of straddling the two worlds of entertainment and politics. And I began my career, I'm from LA, born and raised in Los Angeles. And I grew up at a time in Los Angeles where all my neighbors were in and of the production industry. The guy across the street showed up on Chips as a cast member. My friends down the street had great skateboard ramps because their dads worked on set. It goes on and on. Even my father, Gary Caplan, was sort of an innovator in the licensing and entertainment licensing world. So I grew up in and around production. So I want to tell you first, before we talk about message and strategic communications, how important production is to me and the industry. It's something that I love and care very much about and spent a good amount of time working in production as well. So I came from the world of sort of Los Angeles, just over in the Valley. And my real passion as a young person and then through my early career was working in politics. I went out to Iowa when I was 21 years old, took 24 units in 10 weeks to go work on the Iowa caucus. I got a job offer to go out to Iowa and work on a campaign, in the presidential campaign, for a candidate who didn't last, but is in the White House now. And my folks said, no, you can't go. You haven't graduated. You can't go to Iowa. And I said, well, I'm going. They said, well, you better graduate first. So I took 24 units in 10 weeks, which was a lot for anyone who knows I was at a UC system. So, you know, my interest has always been politics and also entertainment and storytelling. So all those things have driven me in my career. And through a number of really, unbelievable opportunities, and including my time at the AICP, where I spent, I think, 6-7 years, maybe longer, helping to build the industry, I was able to learn and see a lot about creativity, about the power of a message, about how important it is to deliver that message creatively. And also during my time at GMMB, where I was a partner, an agency based out of DC, and I was a partner at GMMB, and I was fortunate enough to be kind of ringside for the Obama for America presidential campaign in 2008. I think I was able to see over the years how important the combination of a really powerful message and delivering that message well through communications, through creativity, is a path to success professionally and in business. And that was where the idea of Message came. And so I launched Message in 2011, have taken on a whole number of great clients, including Comcast, NBC Universal, with whom I've worked for many years. Sutter Health was a client. I worked with a lot of folks, big and small, and was able to bring a lot of creative partners to bear on the work that we did, not just from a PR and messaging standpoint, but creatively. Picked up a couple of awards, including the Ad Age Modern Healthcare Campaign of the Year and some other stuff. So it's been a journey, but at the foundation of my entire professional experience, I think, has been the importance of the power of a message. And when I picked the name, there it was. If you don't mind, I'm going to give you a story real quick about my name, the brand. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's wonderful.
So I started Message. I had this notion of building a brand around the power of that term for strategic communications. We'll talk more about that. And I went and I did a search. I forget what they call it. We searched on the state's database, and I saw that the name Message was taken. Oh, and my dream is over. I'm going to have to call it Message-ish or Message-like. And I look at the name on Message, and it said Michael Remersa. Now, Michael Remersa may predate you and your time in the industry, but Michael was a member of my board at the AICP. Michael Remersa had Bedford Falls, the production company. It was a great, and I suspect still continues in the business. And I said, wow, this is kismet. I'm going to call Michael Remersa. And sure enough, I called their company. And Nancy Novakment was the CFO at the time. And Nancy said, well, yeah, that's a company we set up for a director. If you want it, it's yours.
Wow.
And what does that tell you?
What a small world. Isn't it interesting in a career, these moments just kind of appear that almost make it seem as if it was already written down in stone, you know?
It definitely was a surprise and one of those wonderful experiences where you're like, oh man, I had this great idea and it was taken, and you never know where it takes you. So I encourage people as they're navigating new turfs, new times, to keep an open mind. But that was sort of a fun little story, which I'm not sure I've ever shared because it really wasn't relevant in many instances other than our conversation, talking about our commercial production friends.
It's so funny. You know, Steve, I actually want to go back to something you were touching on related to kind of your broader experience in your career. You've worked in a lot of different industries, both public and private. I'm curious, based off of your experience, what are some key principles that you believe are crucial for effective advocacy today, whether in the public space or in the private markets?
First and foremost, I teach as well at USC, and that's something, that I started in 2019. I teach Introduction to Advertising, Social Media Marketing. I'm teaching a course in political advertising this year. And teaching has really been one of the most incredible professional opportunities in my life. I teach at the Annenberg School at USC and love doing it. And it gives me a chance to think about what shapes effective communication. And at the end of the day, and we can talk about advocacy as a tactic, right? Advocacy can be a way of getting a message out. But my point of view is that strategy is what matters most. Strategy is what should drive everything. And I think that too often companies and advocates start with a goal and objective and don't really spend a lot of time thinking about that strategically. All right, we're going to pass a bill. We're going to get X done. Well, what's the strategy to get there? And why is that our goal? So I really believe that regardless of the tactic, you have to have a strategy first. And in fact, I'm working on a book called Strategy First. So I encourage you all we'll talk hopefully at the end of the show, we can talk more about that. But the notion is that you have to have effective advocacy, you need to develop and determine a strategy. I can talk about one moment, an instance that may be interesting to your viewers. Years ago, we had a very small, tiny program at the state of California called Film California First. Many commercial producers of the older generation will remember it because it was an opportunity to access some incentives for the commercial industry. And when we thought about that bill, the leadership at AICP and all of our board, we were like, well, what can we do that's going to get money in our pockets? That was it isn't just to get an incentive for incentive, because sometimes these credits you have to have a taxable income. They're very complicated. But we were able to create a piece of legislation that was very inexpensive for the state that actually put money directly back in the form of cash rebates to producers. And the members loved it. Our strategy was to not roll with the studios who had different objectives and goals, but to create our own sort of little lane. And we, in terms of advocacy, came up with strategies around talking about small business, vendors and suppliers, and created a sort of message that supported our strategy. So, it's really about determining what your strategy is. And I think right now, many businesses who are challenged by the emergence of AI, technology changes, budget, they need to start thinking, okay, what's our strategy here? So I look at everything through a very strategy first prism. And that's what I teach my students. And we can talk about how advocacy works and how it can be done effectively, but it really depends on what you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. That's really insightful. I think it leads very nicely into what I was hoping to kind of address for our listenership here. Obviously at Wrapbook, we're all about film craft, project-based work, and many of Wrapbook's customers are some of the greatest film organizations in the world. And they really care about policy and labor and the future of the commercial production industry. And there's no one really better to speak to you about that than you, Steve. And so I'm curious though, I mean, I know that your tenure at AICP has since ended, but you're still very tight and close with this industry. But during your tenure as executive vice president at AICP, I'm curious, what were some pivotal changes or challenges in the commercial production industry that you helped address?
I came to AICP. This is going to be my stroll down memory lane a little bit, and I'll drop some names and mention some people just because it's fun. I mean, I came from politics. Okay, I was running political campaigns. In addition to working in Iowa, I was a political director for a guy named Ed Rendell. I served in his administration, even though I'm from Sherman Oaks, worked in Philadelphia. It was deputy mayor there. And Pam Tar, who was a music video producer and the wonderful, talented producer, brought me out to LA. I was in LA. I got recruited for this job. I showed up for a couple of meetings at RSA and over at Radical Media and Frank Sherman, Frank Stiefel. And I showed up for my interviews wearing a blue blazer and a khaki pants and a button-down shirt. And I think they looked at me like I was from Mars. I didn't know. And I show up and there's dogs running around.
It's a very different industry than political advocacy.
Different. But as I said, I grew up in LA and I'm familiar with it, but I had no sort of sense of it. But what struck me immediately was just how creative the industry was. This is, frankly, even before, we have to talk in terms of, unfortunately, in the last 2 decades, recession point moments and major moments of change. Things like the recession of 2008, and then, of course, the 9/11. We've had some real trauma in our industry and in our lives. But when I came to AICP and when I came to the commercials industry, it was a really good time. I'm not going to lie. Creatively, in terms of financially, I think the businesses were doing quite well. And really the biggest difference from the beginning of my tenure to the end, and it happened fast, was the emergence of digital media. It changed everything. And the reason that commercials for many years could be as successful as they were in the commercials industry and as profitable, frankly, was that advertisers had fewer choices to make when it came to producing and buying media.
That there were higher literally technical barriers of entry.
The higher technical barriers of entry. So on the technical side, the ability and the changes on the technology, Kodak was our biggest vendor. Think about that, right? Film. And so film was still huge when I started. And I know it sounds like I'm in the Stone Ages, but it wasn't that long ago. It was not. And we saw the change to digital. So on the technology platform side, there was a massive change, which probably had a lot of cost impacts, production and post impacts. But on the distribution side, you started to see where advertisers were like, okay, we've got a moment with primetime advertising, with must-see TV, and we're going to make an ad for a new brand. We're going to put a lot of money into that ad, and because 15 million people are going to be watching it, we know they're going to be there, to several years later in the early 2000s where those ads were being seen on digital platforms, created in different ways, finished in different ways, and the media buys were different. So I think that the industry had to adapt and change, and it has. I think that change came a little bit slowly, but we did some really cool things. I think the question was sort of, what did we do to address those? Well, I was very involved with Matt Miller and a lot of other great folks at AICP in creating an entity that we called AICP Next, which continues, I believe, to sort of be a vital part of AICP's work. But the whole objective there was to sort of talk about, well, what are we going to do when all these things change? And that was a lot of the early work we did. And on the labor side, people like Jane Nunez and Matt Miller were trying to keep an eye on how those changes would affect our labor contracts, which I think was another interesting issue. And I think the unions are still, frankly, struggling with. And I hope they get that resolved. That's a whole nother issue, which I'm happy to talk about. But I think that was probably, from a business standpoint, the biggest change in the 7 years that I was there was that the movement from, traditional production using film and all the technologies that existed to where we are and got to it around the mid to late 2000s. But more importantly, in some ways for the industry, what it meant for the amount of content that needed to be created and how it would get created and how people would get compensated for it.
Right. That's the interesting thing about the digital proliferation is that the technical barriers of entrance of actually making technical film that had high craft and high value and was entertaining to watch, it went down. But then also the proliferation of screens and the amount of time that could be spent engaging with media increased exponentially. So you have this totally interesting sort of dynamic. And something that I've observed, Steve, is like, these cheaper forms of content work for a little while, and then consumers seem to get bored of it. And they want more film craft, more novelty, more like rich film narrative craft and novelty as these distribution methods kind of mature out. And so it's been an interesting thing. It used to be, and you can still like see many millions of hours of screen time going to random YouTube content. But at the actual bleeding edge, though, you look at somebody like Mr. Beast, he's spending millions of dollars per production and is the definite winner on that platform. So it is interesting to see how these things are playing out even now compared to when you were dealing with it as a sort of an emergent phenomenon in the industry.
We always have a tendency to say and to think to ourselves, well, the end is near, the good times are over. And that was, certainly a fear from some people, not all of the people in the commercials industry, that digital technology would change the way the business ran and that the margins would go down. A lot of concerns about the business. But in each turn, there were always people in the industry who said, no, this is an opportunity and there is more content being made. And what people need to see is, content that can cut through, that looks good, that's persuasive. And I think the agencies are doing a pretty good job of that in some cases. And the creators, though, the creator economy is real. And it's changed that dynamic. I would say that, even as we think about AI, and I'm spending quite a bit of time talking and writing about that on a blog, Substack, which I encourage all your readers to follow, called Control Alt Persuade. And we can talk more about that a little bit if you're interested. Talking about the importance of AI, a lot of the concern right now is about things like deep fakes and in the political and public policy world, and even in entertainment, we saw the Scarlett Johansson concern with chat using her voice. And I think producers and vendors need to think about, okay, strategically, how are we going to benefit from this? How do we make sure we're not the last man standing or the last group standing or the last people standing? And I think that's where the challenge is going to be. And a lot of people will probably think about, well, how can we use these tools to streamline processes, which is a good thing. But I'm not sure that's the question. It's about relevance. How does our business and our industry stay relevant at a time when the filmmaking craft is going to change? And I actually think there's a lot of relevance for producers. They just need to think strategically.
I do think we should dig in on this, Steve. So at the time of this recording, the AICP just hosted its sort of annual AICP week. And the topic on everyone's minds was generative AI, generative AI, generative AI. So as the commercial production landscape evolves, we talked about digital film craft and its repercussions on the industry that we're still feeling now. Let's extend that past just digital cameras, digital workflow software, and expand the scope of the conversation to generative AI and the fact that you've been thinking about this. What advice are you giving today's producers to stay relevant and to stay successful given this massive sea change? And by the way, I know that people in the industry, our industry, the film business, are quite curious. Some are scared, some are excited. But what's fascinating about this moment is it is applicable to every industry: software development, medicine, law, things that I'm not even thinking about. Across dinner tables globally, I think professionals, knowledge workers are talking about this and wondering what the ramifications will be.
The commercial production industry specifically, I have some thoughts. Formative. I wasn't at MoMA or don't know what the gist of whomever was on the panel spoke about. And I'm curious. I'd love to see what their thoughts are. It's funny. I think you're right. Professionals and all of us are sitting around dinner tables considering this. One of the things that drove me to develop a concept called Strategy First in the book that I'm writing wasn't even just sort of us, meaning you and me, the producers who were all around that table. It's like, I've got 2 college-age kids who are going out in the workforce. And it was like, wait a minute. So what's their future? How are they going to thrive in this new world. So I think it absolutely is going to take, I mean, there's a lot of approaches to it. There's a government role and responsibility, but as business people, we need to think about the role we fill and what it is that we offer of value to our clients and our customers, and then adapt the tools to support that. I mean, it would maybe be a bit of more of a back and forth as it relates to the commercial production industry. But if I was sitting over at the chair of an executive producer owner's office, I'd be thinking really seriously about the model itself. A model that for years has been driven by, and I say this with love because I was able to work with some of the greatest directors in the world on projects to create advertising almost entirely because of my relationship in the commercial production industry. I had Joel Schumacher shoot a meth ad targeting gay men who were using meth when I was at GMMB. I worked with Rich Carter's company to do an ad around healthcare reform. Gary Rose's company with the Motion Picture Association on piracy, Frank Sherman, many others who were generous with their directors. And that was the talent and the equity, and I understand that equity. In 5 years, our director is going to be the core equity for a production company. Is the role of a director now still that visionary going to be executed through AI, or are they less relevant? And I say that again, nobody is higher on my list of people I admire for their creative skill than film directors. And I'm not trying to say they will be irrelevant, but producers produce. Production company's job is to execute a production. And I would argue that if I was a producer, I'd be looking to my agency partners and my clients and saying, look, however you need this done, we'll get it done, because that's what we do. We produce. And if it requires understanding of the platforms, the software platforms, we have some of the best technologists who are now going to be on our roster. So I think there's a lot of exploration in that regard. And I'm not suggesting that the director-driven model go away. And I'm not even sure it will. I'm sure the DGA would have something to say about that. And I'm not sure how directors are thinking about their futures in an AI world. Will they be working behind a different kind of screen? And do they bring their same talents as creators to bear? But as a production company model goes, bottom line, I'd have to say, whatever changes come to us, our job is to produce and to execute by any means necessary. Nobody knows how to do that better than us. And we did it with film, we did it with digital, we'll do it here. And the tools may change, but we're going to deliver you the product you need. But it may also require major changes in the business model with revenue streams, markup, the way that margins work and budgets and the rest. So that's probably a much longer conversation, and one that I'd love to have in a room with some other producers or folks at some time. But that's sort of my answer as it relates to commercial production, that you need to roll with those changes. But there may be big business model changes ahead, and whether the industry has the appetite to do that or not will be quite interesting for me as maybe in an academic sense.
I think what's really interesting about what you're saying, Steve, is it is aligned with sort of my own individual forecasting on this, which is there will be business model disruption, but therein lies tremendous opportunity. Some of the conjecture and hypotheses being floated around in the software space related to generative AI is that you may theoretically be able to see $1 billion market cap companies operated by 10 people instead of thousands of people or hundreds of people, because there's this sort of inversion where, there was an old adage that ideas didn't matter, but execution did. As tooling becomes automated, or as we potentially forge a path to create agents to execute this type of labor for us, the actual critical linchpin is the idea's value in and of itself. And so maybe the business model is, yes, it's commercials, but it's also software, and it's also other sort of digital experiences collectively around some visionary director's modality. I mean, I think what's so interesting about film craft is it is as an art form, something that utilizes sight, sound, props, acting. It's the one art form that sort of utilizes all arts and crafts in one space. Why not actually just extend that metaphor further to now it also encapsulates software. Now it actually encapsulates experiences. Now it encapsulates a full world building experience maybe both physical and digital, if you have a sort of a super intelligence enabling you from a tooling perspective to accomplish whatever your imagination is sort of coming up with. I think that's like a really extended philosophical bet. I do think that there is an alignment with sort of what you're saying in that. And how to monetize that, like, is the question. And I think that that will be a relationship between producers and direct. And maybe the titles of what these roles are change, but building a dream machine has kind of been the goal of producers forever. The output of that dream machine changes given these new tools that we have.
I think you're onto something exactly right. I mean, look, it shouldn't matter what the assets are to create, but you should use whatever tools you have to create the best work possible and be masters at those tools and of the process of delivering. For a producer, it's like, look, we got this. Everyone's scared, and the agencies are scared, and the clients are scared. And the thing that takes it to the human side of the impacts of this, though, and one that I think is, as you all work in the service to the industry and the payroll industry and the numbers of people, I think that one of the hurdles here is, I think at some point we had 260,000 people in Los Angeles County who earned their primary living or worked in the film industry. And this is going to be, when you go from thousands of people making something to hundreds to tens of people, this is the big question. This is not a business question, but a human question. And it does get to philosophy. And what about those folks? And what about the gaffer and the grip and the electrician? And I'm deeply concerned about those folks as well. Although I think with retraining and some other tools, hopefully that, can be deployed, those folks will find a path that makes sense. But for the production, for the producer, for the owner of a production company, I guess that the question of what value you're adding and how you're adding value and solving problems probably becomes more important in an AI world than the commodity which perhaps drove success, which was probably more around a director's reel and a director's vision. And again, this is probably controversial to say, and we're just riffing. I'd probably need to turn it around a little bit as a strategic matter and say, okay, if say I'm representing directors as a consultant, how do I change and adapt their value to be more relevant? But I'm just thinking about it through the lens of a production company. And if I was sitting behind that desk, I'd say, we're in on this. We're ready to go. Whatever problems you need solved, we'll solve them. And it could be through a technology partner. It could be through some folks up in Silicon Valley or overseas, or it could be through our director who has those skills. But I think there's an opportunity here. It's just going to it's going to be a big change in people's mindsets, a big change.
Totally. I mean, I think you're seeing some instances of this. So Mark Romanek is now at Super Prime, and I believe he's playing with like Sora, other generative AI tools. I mean, it will be interesting, and I do think there will be change. However, I think this idea of visionary, creative, novel thinking can be unleashed in a new, powerful way, which is exciting, even though it will be disruptive. There's no doubt.
It will be. And I think the question, who grabs those tools and who uses them. And if I was to say for my kids, as I spend some time working in the AI space and more from the generative side with simple things, support for curricula I build and the academic world, business plan support, other sorts of projects I take, it's mind-blowing how as a partner, it can support high-level thinking, but it's only as good as the inputs it gets, creatively or strategically. And I think that's sort of the big myth. And that's where maybe a Mark Romanek can ask the question of the technology that creates visual platform, not Wall-E.
Well, there's Sora. Yeah.
The prompts and the cues and how you construct that is a creative process, I presume. And I love to sit in the room with someone as talented as Mark Romanek and say, okay, what are you asking it? How are you getting there? But on the other hand, somebody who isn't a perhaps visionary visually, but has a lot going on up here, and I'm thinking about the kids, right? I'm thinking about my kids, may be able to generate the same kind of thinking and prompts and be a director in a very different way.
Absolutely.
And that will be super interesting in the next few years. So I think it's an exciting time. And, for a business to embrace this technology, but not to necessarily talk about it as like the worst thing you can do. And I'm giving out a lot of free counsel here, and I'm happy to do, I'm joking, is to make it a race to the bottom, to say, look, we're going to cut costs. We're going to be able to do things cheaper and faster and with less people. because that will never end well. You have to, as a business, continue to offer a value that goes beyond a commodity. And commoditization is something I think that the industry struggled with in the commercials world as competition grew at a certain point, but that's probably a different topic.
I think, Steve, I want to double click on that really quick as kind of our last question for you, in terms of the fact that you have your own children that you're providing some guidance and advice to. You have other people's children that you're providing guidance and advice to as a professor at USC. You know, as someone who has been mentored yourself and someone who is mentoring, you know, what are the key pieces of advice that you find yourself giving to these up and coming professionals, and specifically around your areas of expertise in communication, strategic thinking, and that tie into production that you have as well?
Yeah, I think one of the tools that, you know, my career was really interesting. I started in politics. I'd work in a campaign in an even year, and I'd come back to Hollywood in an off year and worked at the DGA and did a lot of different projects. Then I went to AICP and I saw incredible creative work. Some of the best stuff on the screen I'd ever seen in my life was created by commercial producers, visually stunning and amazing, and go to the MoMA show and see this remarkable work. Then I went to an agency and I was a partner at that agency. My first job in an agency was as a partner, which is not the way it usually works. When I started my own company, Message, I had to kind of go back to the drawing board in a lot of ways. And I brought in team members, including creative director and a media buyer and the rest. And it was really the first time I started thinking about a creative brief in a real way. Like, I didn't have to think about creative briefs. I just figured this stuff gets made and it's beautiful because I was always up here. And what I always tell my students, and I showcase, and I'll say this with love to my friends at Cannes and MoMA, I'll show a sizzle reel of all this great visual stuff that's created and shot by filmmakers who spend millions of dollars. And I'll say, you guys like that? And I'll say, oh, it was so cool. I said, so what was the idea? What were they trying to say? I don't know. Well, creative brief and the discipline of a brief requires you to go back and look and say, okay, what's our goal? What's our objective? What's our strategy to get there? The brief distills all the sort of stuff out there into a document that lets you be disciplined to get to that single most important message. Again, which is why I called my company Message. So I would say to anybody, the best advice is to not get distracted by the sizzle, which is fun. I love it. But to really think about why it's being done. And I can tell you about 1 million ads that were executed to look great, and those brands are out of business. And so to me, it's about the idea about distilling your big thinking into a simple, articulated, a message you can articulate, a strategy that you understand, goals and objectives that are reasonable. And that's hard for anybody to learn, let alone kids, young people. But what I try and teach and talk about with clients as well as with my students is, look, it looks great. That stuff may look awesome and even make you feel something emotionally, but is it in service of what the brand's trying to achieve or the business is trying to achieve? And when I talk about my journey being backwards, I had to work for 15 years before I kind of really, through the partnership of working with creative directors and strategists, and this is me confessing on a confessional, I didn't know about that stuff. I just thought the stuff got made by great filmmakers and production companies, and it was on the screen. So I would say that really thinking, and again, a strategy-first approach, thinking about what is the goal and objective. And a creative brief is an unbelievable tool. I've often thought that, like, it would be really fun to deploy a creative brief approach across industries and go into
your wedding vows.
Yeah.
To your intention of raising your family, to your intention of doing anything.
To your intention of doing anything. What is our single most important message? Who is our audience? What are we trying to achieve? And that discipline, I think, is super important. And it's what I try to, I think in my introduction to advertising class, I'm in a 14-week session. I spend 4 or 5 sessions on the brief in less than half. And I love Frank Sherman comes in and talks about production. So I'm going to give a shout out to Frank Sherman, Radical Media here for doing that. as have some other great creative partners in the past. But I think the strategic insight's what's most important.
Amazing. Well, Steve, thank you for joining me on Production. You are a well of information. And I just want to ask, for folks that are interested in kind of following your Substack, following up on your book, getting access to the resources that you produce, tell us where people can find you.
My brand company, it's Message, and you can go to our website at messagela.com, which is the site for the firm. Definitely a lot of the work I'm doing. I've recently published in Salon, and Adweek is likely publishing an article I just wrote about the public apologies in advertising and applying them to the political world. But my Substack, called Control, Alt, Persuade, studies and talks about political advertising, media, and technology. So it's very much a niche of politics. But in this cycle of political advertising, in an election year, I thought it was incredibly important to talk about it from an insider's view. There's going to be $18 billion spent on political advertising this cycle. Frankly, it's what's going to lift the boat of the ad world in this year. So we're going to see some positive economic energy coming out of mostly political advertising. So Control, Alt, Persuade is my Substack. My readers and subscribers will be getting a teaser version of Strategy First. So it is a hard pitch, but that's what we do here. So I urge you and encourage you to come follow me there, and I'll be sharing more of the book there. And hopefully I can come back with you in a few months and tell you about its publishing and how it's going to be available.
You absolutely can. Thanks so much, Steve.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
On Production is brought to you by Wrapbook. With automated time card calculations, real-time production accounting, and payroll you can run with just a click, Wrapbook makes it easier than ever to manage your entire production from one login. To learn more about how Wrapbook is transforming payroll and production accounting, check out our website at wrapbook.com.